I joined Google, and Google is famous for the fact that Larry literally looked at every hiring packet, including resume. 12 years after graduating college, had to provide my SAT scores to Google. I had to go find them. I had to provide my college transcript, which everyone did. It was a very credential-driven place, which was accounted for a lot of the talent density there, but also led to blind spots. Google, just take another example. Google, I was one of the last product managers hired into Google who did not have a computer science degree. And because of that computer science requirement to be a product manager, people like Kevin Systrom weren't allowed to be product managers at Google, right? So he went off and founded a little company called Instagram.
Jag, I am so excited for this show today. I've heard so many great things from many different people with different stories, but especially the main man, David Velez. So thank you so much for joining me today, my friend.
I'm so excited to be here, Harry. I'm a huge fan of the show, as you know.
That is so kind of you. But when I spoke to David, he asked the first most important question. You went from a cushy job at Meta, working in the Valley, to working for a Brazilian fintech that no one really knew about at the time. Why did you do it, he asked.
Well, as he well knows, David is an extraordinarily persuasive guy. So that's the first thing. The first conversation I had with David, when he asked me towards the end, would you ever consider moving to Sao Paulo? I thought, I said, David, the obvious answer is no. And this is a crazy request. But he's a very persuasive guy, because when I gave him that answer, he said, well, there are people working here who are far more definitive than you are, so we should keep chatting. Doug Leone played a part in persuading me. But the larger reason is I had spent the previous almost 15 years at that point working at Google, at Quantcast, at Facebook, basically in media tech and ad tech, as it was the center of what was happening in Silicon Valley, and had come to realize that I had a ringside seat to the great disruption story of the previous 15 years, and that was amazing, intellectually, incredibly interesting. But I had developed a toolkit that I was applying to serve what is effectively the richest billion people on the planet: the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And what David and Nubank offered was the chance to take that same toolkit and apply it to, roughly speaking, the bottom half of the global income pyramid. I had grown up in the Caribbean, so roughly speaking, depending on how you count the English-speaking Caribbean, I am roughly Latin American. And the opportunity to apply to the bottom half of the income pyramid, the toolkit I had gotten in my roughly speaking home region, was really exciting. It also came, the second reason, and the thing that became clear to me as I started talking with David and the Nubank team, was that media tech and ad tech had kind of played itself out, and I had been on both sides. I had worked for Google and Facebook. I had worked for a challenger startup, but the game had kind of consolidated. Fintech is, even today, 3 years later, still very much in its early innings, and we still have this 20-year game to play itself out. And being in at the ground floor in the beginning of an industry that's just starting to fundamentally change. And I firmly believe the next set of bits to be disrupted after the media industry, the obvious next set of bits is reais, dollars, pesos, pounds, euros. And the technology's ready, and it's time to go. So it was just too big an opportunity to pass up.
There's so many things for me to unpack there. You mentioned the word toolkit multiple times and kind of utilizing that toolkit. I think there's this kind of common question in product, which is like, to what extent is it art or science? Incredibly difficult question, which, is an utterly shit question, really. But I thought I would ask it anyway.
Okay.
Is product more art or science? And what would you say it would be if you had to rank it? 70-30, 80-20?
Yeah, I've heard you ask this question of a number of product leaders over the last year or so, from Gustav to Kevin Weil and others, and I've liked their answers. I'll give you my take on the answer. I have tried, and we have tried at Nubank, especially over the last 3 years, to make it as scientific as we possibly can, and we've pushed the envelope, and I think there's still further to go. I think you can make it 90% science. The thing about product management is it's a pretty new discipline. When an engineer shows up at a tech company or a salesperson shows up at a tech company, they kind of know what the job is. When I showed up at Google in 2006, no one really had a definition for what a product manager was. They showed you where the bathroom was, and then they sort of dropped you in a team and said, go. And over the last 15 years, and you've had Marty Kagan and others on, it's become gradually more scientific. And so I think we can make it, and we're on the cusp of making it. I don't think we're quite there, but I think we're on the cusp of making it 90% science. What is the science of understanding product market fit? How do you make it metrics driven more than like gut feel? Having said that, I think the last 10% and the most important 10% and the 10% that makes all of the difference is still art. And once you get the science, you get like to the start line of having a shot at winning the race. But it's the 10% of art that is how you win that race.
What is in the art? If we're in the science and we're like determining product market fit, all of the kind of metricized elements that we now have with the data tools that we have, what is in the 10% of art still?
Yeah, and I'm still figuring out the answer to that question every day, learning from my team every day. But I think the heart of it, and it's the hardest part to make scientific, is the empathy with the customer. What is that specific thing that we're going to focus on that creates the magic for them, that really taps into a deeply unmet need? The thing is, and the pitfall is, you can do customer research. You can go ask customers. But I tell the product team at Nubank all the time, we are not in the business of taking dictation from our customers. Because if we were, we would just send the engineer instead of us. And we'd no need for the middleman. We have to listen to the customer, better yet, observe the customer to interpret what their unmet need is and what the hierarchy of those unmet needs are and where the magic is. And then you apply business filters and everything else to see if there's, profit to be had. But that empathy and that intuition for where the real unmet need is something that is very hard to make scientific, and is something that, you can be called with the official title of product manager, or you can be a guy named David Velez, who isn't technically a product manager, but came up with a magical idea 10 years ago, and just had that intuition for where the pain was that was sharp, and that would create this visceral reaction from the Brazilian consumer. And that is hard to replicate.
This is me sitting down now because it's got serious. My question to you is, what makes a good question? I think the majority of customer development actually sucks because people don't ask good questions. What's a good question?
For my money, and look, I've learned this mostly by doing the opposite and making the mistake. It's about exploring the customer's problem rather than the solution. And even when you're exploring the problem, you don't ask about the problem directly. You ask about the customer's life around whatever area you're interested in. And customers don't even realize when they are employing workarounds, when they are making do, when they think everything is fine, but if you somehow showed up with something completely different, you can change their lives. And so I think where we tend to fall short in the industry today, even still, is we spend a lot of time trying to pitch the solution, ask about the solution. We spend not nearly enough time talking about the problem. And when we are talking about the problem, we're mostly asking about it rather than asking around it and observing around it, because it's our job to synthesize that.
Do you worry that by asking around it, you can lead them to a conclusion? Jag, don't you find it difficult when you have to wait 3 days for your, salary to come through? Yes, I guess so. Yes, but do you know what I mean? You're leading the witness.
Yeah, for my money, and one of the hardest things for especially product managers who are earlier in their careers to wrap their head around is we should never fall in love with our belief or our hypothesis. And most of us can't help but become the lawyer, the advocate for the idea. And what is really important is to have a hypothesis, to be really clear on your hypothesis, not to go in with a vague set of, I want to ask you about this general area of your life, but to have a couple of sharp hypotheses you're out to test, but to be entirely agnostic, not in love with any of those ideas, to approach it more as a judge than a lawyer. So you've got to have a sharp hypothesis, but also not fall in love with the hypothesis. It runs completely contrary to human nature to come up with an idea and keep your distance from it at the same time. And that's, I think, what makes it hard.
How do you do it? You spend time on it. With time, you have commitment, and with commitment, you have love. Fuck me, this is a dating show, Jag. But like, you know, when you've sacrificed other things to dedicate time and commitment and energy and passion to it, it's human nature. How do you detach yourself from it?
Yeah, you know, the one step, which is very hard, but is not even enough, is to at least fall in love with the problem, not the specific solution. David, you know, just to take that Nubank example, was in love with the potential of unleashing the Latin American consumer who was being really badly served. He wasn't in love with, I need to build a credit card because of XYZ reason or business case. And so first you start with at least being in love with the problem. And then when you're in love with the problem, the solution can come out in any one of a dozen or 24 or 100 different ways. And you're just keeping your ear to the ground to see, how can I unleash this bigger idea, this bigger opportunity? That's the key. Whereas falling in love with a specific idea before you've proven it just means you're going to end up leading the witness, and you're going to hear what you want to hear. And that's always a trap.
Jag, before we dive into the meat of the show, I do just have to ask, you spent several years at Facebook as a director of product management. It's a pretty heavy role at a pretty important time for the company. What are one or two takeaways for you that really impacted how you think about product today?
You know, Facebook has its share of pitfalls in how it operates, but it has a few things it does extremely well, which in at least a couple of cases dovetailed with things that I really needed to learn, especially at the time. One of them, and this sort of builds actually ironically off what we were just talking about, is I had a tendency to A, enjoy the argument, and B, get entrenched in my position, not with the customer, but internal. And one of the things that Facebook does incredibly well, especially at the senior levels, is I have a strong point of view as director A, and you have a strong point of view as director B, and we need to collaborate. And Facebook is built for it. You have to collaborate across business areas to make something big happen. And Facebook was incredibly good at saying, and I had to learn this from a number of people, but they were incredibly good at simply saying, you think X, I think Y. By the end of this week, the latest, we are going to either agree, disagree, and know why, and escalate. And the speed of escalation, it wasn't like, I think X, you think Y, let's come back in a week, discuss it some more, and then in a week after that, we're going to escalate it. It was like, I think X, you think Y. By the end of day, we're going to agree if we can come to a consensus or escalate. And that speed of escalation, I think, ties to Facebook's historical, always impressive speed of execution. And that was probably the single biggest thing I learned there, which has been so valuable for me since.
I was speaking to a $50 billion CEO today who's a friend of mine, and he said, you know, at the end of the day, when you get to a size like ours and bluntly like Nubank, I'm adding that, he didn't use that.
Yeah.
And you know, you're fighting off eventual mediocrity, and you're fighting off eventual slowness. Um,
Yes.
my question to you is, when you think about Facebook operating at that execution speed, how do you retain that speed and agility when you are Nubank today with such large teams and very real processes and bluntly heavy corporate structures?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a few things. We have a CEO who's a founder, and he fights the natural creep of corporate process, even including ones that I try to introduce at times. And I think that's a helpful counterforce, countergravity. But I think there are two things, and again, these things are over the last 10 years getting more and more codified amongst the really great companies. My wife used to work at Amazon, so we lived, and I heard in the early days about two pizza box teams. At Google, we used to talk about a team should be like a family. You should be able to feed it around the table. So we at Nubank, we do a couple of things fairly religiously. We try to keep teams very small, actually. We might have many of them focusing on many things as the company grows, but we try very hard to keep the size of teams small. That's a really important thing. And the second thing, which we just talked about, is when you get stuck, don't stay stuck. Escalate. Someone will make a call. A bad decision, which can be iterated on, is better than no decision at all, because you start learning from the market and from customers. And very few decisions are, as Bezos would say, one-way doors. So escalate and decide, and keep your team small. And at Nubank, there was a religion, which is sometimes hard as a senior exec. There's a religion around autonomy, and we try to give our general managers and even folks who are more junior than that a lot of autonomy to make decisions about where they're taking their product or their business.
Do you inherently trust people? I know that sounds weird, but you said about autonomy there. There's two ways, which is full trust from day one and it's yours to be lost, or you gain trust over time. I inherently don't trust people, which is why I will die alone with my cat. I need to actually get the cat. I'm just alone now. But do you trust people from the start, or is it to be gained over time?
I tend to default to trusting people from the start. We had a mantra at Facebook, and speaking of lessons from there, about assuming good intent. It was built into the cultural training there. I think assuming good intent, trusting people. I don't trust people at the recruiting stage. When I'm recruiting someone, my default answer is they're not good enough to join the company. But once they've proven that, and we've decided to extend an offer, I'm going to assume that you are Nubank quality. We try to keep a very high bar. And then I'm going to try to give you as much room to run and show me what you can do. And look, if you make mistakes along the way, we'll correct them. We all do. And if you make too many mistakes, then we have to have more difficult conversations. But I think the right starting point is to give people that trust and give them the room to run.
You mentioned there the pre-hiring process. We have about 700,000 founders that listen, so no worries that you're about to impact many thousands of teams. But I do have to ask about the hiring process. I know we're mixing the schedule up, but fuck it, let's do it. How do you structure your hiring process today? What's the right way to structure a hiring process for a product team?
I really struggle with this. I don't know that I have a good answer, and if anything, I've lost confidence over time and over the years and over the last decade rather than gained it.
Why? What's led you to lose confidence?
Well,
Mishires? Not
yeah,
hiring?
some mistakes in hiring, some great understanding that, again, and some of this is commonplace understanding, but first of all, understanding that credentials matter less than I thought, that someone who had gone to the right school, the right program, the right grades, the right company, and any combination of all of those things isn't necessarily right for your situation at your time. One. Two, a gradual understanding, and I know you're a football fan, and I'm a huge football fan, and I'm really happy this morning because Man U is back after a decade. But team matters. I think we've seen that in the world of football since Pep came along. 15 years ago. The team matters. And so no matter how many Galacticos, how many All-Stars you've got on the team, it doesn't mean that the whole is going to be greater than the sum of the parts. And so recruiting someone who is going to fit the need, fit the team, fit the problem, and you don't have the like normal signposts of credentials necessarily as like a definitive guarantee. I after consulting, I joined Google, and Google is famous for the fact that Larry literally looked at every hiring packet, including resume. 12 years after graduating college, had to provide my SAT scores to Google. I had to go find them. I had to provide my college transcript, which everyone did. It was a very credential-driven place, which was accounted for a lot of the talent density there, but also led to blind spots. And so, Google, just take another example. Google, I was one of the last product managers hired into Google who did not have a computer science degree. And because of that computer science requirement to be a product manager, people like Kevin Systrom weren't allowed to be product managers at Google, right? So he went off and founded a little company called Instagram. And there were a number of those types of people who went on to found great companies. So the thing that I used to think was very scientific has become more in terms of recruiting, and I used to feel a lot of confidence and clarity about it. It feels more and more like art to me, and I think that means I just don't understand it well enough.
So with the signals of clarity being less definitive in terms of quality, school, grades, prior companies, you name it, then there's something else. What questions do you ask to try and unveil my character? And imagine I'm an angel investment of yours and you're advising me, I'm a CEO, I don't know what to ask. What questions should I ask to determine quality of product?
There are sort of two flavors of questions I tend to ask these days. One is a set of questions around drive. At Facebook, it was an interview stream called Leadership and Drive. But the thing I really look for is drive, because there are a lot of really smart people who don't actually have that inherent drive for greatness, who will walk through fire, break through walls to achieve greatness. They're really, really sharp. But without that drive, it especially in a startup type environment where the odds are stacked against you, you're supposed to fail. The odds are that you will fail. Drive is more important than IQ points. So there's a set of questions around what's the hardest thing you've done? Tell me about a time when you're in a situation where you didn't know what the answer was. I took a class in a leadership. It was supposed to be a leadership class in graduate school. And it basically was inherently designed, the professor was a psychologist, and it was inherently designed to be a Lord of the Flies exercise over the course of the semester. When you had Israeli fighter pilots and BBC journalists and this amazing variety of people. And for example, one class, the professor walks in, puts his briefcase down, sits down and doesn't say a word for 45 minutes. And you just sort of see what 100 type A, Harvard people will do. And it's just this amazing psychological experiment. But this drive to take command of a situation, but also to collaborate and bring people in, it's not drive for power's sake, it's drive for getting something done, is a really important thing. And the core thing I took away from that class after spending 3/4 of it not understanding why in the hell I was in it, I was like, what are we doing here? He had a phrase near the end, which really resonated with me. I use it almost every week, is, are you able to stomach your own incompetence? Are you able to enter into a situation where you do not know what the answer is and dive in anyway? Which I think is the essence of building something new. So there's a set of questions I ask around that. And then the other one is clarity. It's pure coincidence that you had Kevin Systrom on recently, but I'm not generally in the habit at least for the last 10, 15 years, of looking for advice from 20-somethings. But Kevin Systrom, back before Instagram was famous, certainly before it was bought by Facebook, I heard Kevin at some conference say, we may not be right, but at least we are clear. And I love that, because I think that's the other thing. I'm looking for someone. And so I would ask questions simply like, you used to work at this company, or you founded this company 10, 12, 15 years ago. It may not have been a successful company. It doesn't really matter. Tell me about the company. And I just want to know how clearly you can explain to me, as someone who knows nothing about your business, so that I can understand if it seems to make any sense. It may not make sense. I don't have the technical capability to understand if your startup made sense. But did it make sense, or your product, or whatever you're working on? But I want to know if you can tell me clearly. If you spend 5 minutes telling me and I've zoned out and I don't understand what you said anyway, which, by the way, is 3/4 of most answers, then you're not going to have the clarity to lead a team to something that's truly breakthrough. And so I'm looking for clarity and I'm looking for drive. And I still don't know if I have the right questions to get to those things, but that's what I'm reaching for.
You said clarity there, and it takes me to something you said before to me, before the show, which was on the importance of execution, or sorry, the lack of importance of execution and the importance of strategic clarity. Like, what did you mean by like the lack of importance or execution being overrated and strategic clarity being underrated?
Yeah, I'm being a little contrarian, but, I spent a number of years as a strategy consultant, and which has its own pitfalls for sure. But it's almost mantra at this point. I actually think it's fairly lazy mantra in Silicon Valley and in tech in general to say strategy is easy and execution is everything. And look, to be very clear, execution is massively important. But execution without strategic clarity is basically frenzy. It is not progress. It is not forward motion.
I'm interrupting. I'm so sorry. Is it not about the amount of at-bats, though? With every bit you learn. And so, like, I always say the speed of execution is the single biggest driver in the companies that I see succeed that I've invested in, because they have a structure and a mechanism where they execute, learn, change, execute again.
Completely. I think there's one piece missing in the framework you just outlined, though. If you are executing and you don't know what you are executing towards, you cannot take the signal that's coming back at you and iterate. If you have a clear hypothesis of the case, a theory of the case as to what you're supposed to get back, what your strategy is trying to achieve, then all the data you're getting back becomes signal. And you can react very clearly and definitively, so your next iteration is in the right direction. Your strategy does not have to be perfect. It has to be clear so that you can take the signal back from the customer or the market and iterate in some clear direction. Otherwise, you're often running in circles.
Can I ask, what would be an example of this, just so I understand it more clearly? So you said there about kind of actually strategically being clear about knowing where you're going or what you're wanting. What would be an example of that in product?
Let me give you an example. So, which is one we have wrestled with fairly recently at Nubank. And I'll speak a little bit generically. If you've got a hypothesis for a product and you launch it out in the market, and you're not careful about who you've launched it to or how you've positioned it, and you get a bunch of signal that says, hey, as we did at Nubank, hey, the NPS on this product is actually quite mediocre. And you just look at your average NPS and says, this product just doesn't seem to be resonating. You might iterate in any number of directions, kill the product, iterate the product in some incorrect direction. What we've ended up finding was, hey, peel underneath the data. There is a set of customers, which was actually the set of customers we meant the product to be for, who love the product. They're actually a small minority of the people who we've given the product to right now. And there's a bunch of customers who don't like the product. But you know what? It turns out this product wasn't designed for them. It wasn't built for them. Of course they don't like it. There's no reason why they should like it. So that's in part a story about de-averaging, but it's also a part in story about saying, and this is what strategy is. I am building this product for this specific set of customers, this specific group segment of customers, to meet this deep unmet need. Do they like it or not? If those customers don't like it, then you start to ask a series of why questions. Why don't you like it? What is it about the product that isn't working? Is it we executed it poorly? Is it fundamentally misconceived? How do we iterate it? If it turns out, however, which is what we found quite recently, those customers love it, but we've been giving it to a bunch of customers for whom it wasn't intended, and they don't like it, you've actually got confirmation that you're onto something. And the problem isn't to iterate the product, it's to get the product into the hands of the right customers. Completely different answers. And that's what I mean. If you do not have a clear hypothesis, a clearly articulated strategy of how you plan to win, you can execute with speed, with velocity, with quality, and never get there. And that happens all the time.
Do you know what I find so hard about how you plan to win? I had this realization. I was with Alex Schultz, the CMO of Facebook, the other day. Or Meta, sorry, he did the rebrand, so he'll kill me if he heard me say Facebook. And he taught me actually the most brilliant thing, which was actually, when you think about how to win or setting goals, the truth is most of it's gameable. If you say I want 1,000 users, your growth and marketing team could spend on ads and get shit users that churn, but your goal was 1,000 users. Yeah. I have with my investment partner, he needs to meet 30 companies a week. He hasn't done a deal in 3 months. Maybe that's the wrong fucking goal. My point is, how do you align goals to strategic outcomes that move the needle for the business?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things. That's, by the way, what Facebook and Alex is one of the framers of that approach. That's what Facebook calls execution, is aligning your success metrics and agreeing the success metrics that actually align with winning. You've actually referred to something that I've seen many, many times, and I think is one of the things that we all theoretically know, and one of the things that we almost never actually live, which is the following. It's exactly what Alex was describing to you. There are all sorts of very elegant product management frameworks about the stages of building and launching and having a product succeed. I tend to break it down into basically 2 stages. There is pre-product market fit and there's post-product market fit. And your job in each stage is completely different. And the problem that companies often have, product people often have, frankly, CEOs often have, is they think of building a product as I build it, I get it launched, and then I start scaling it and it's success mode. And there's actually the most important piece in the middle, which is I got to get this product that's just launched, that probably isn't quite right yet, to product market fit, to customer love, to use a more evocative phrase. And if I don't get customer love, scaling is like pushing the rock uphill, and I can game it. Any great growth person can run ads, can do any number of tricks of the trade. And you can get to the next round. That can go in a good bull market for a long time. But if you have customer love, and this was the magic of early Nubank, your customers are your marketing, and the snowball is rolling downhill instead of you trying to push the rock uphill. And so there are a couple of ways to answer your question. The first way, though, the most mechanical way to answer your question is, if you don't have a customer love metric, I learned actually when I moved to Sao Paulo back in the beginning of 2020 from the Brazilian, the Nubank product team, about this technique that was starting to take off in Silicon Valley where I was living, called the Sean Ellis circle, which is an attempt to bring science to product market fit that I've come to really love. You can use NPS scores. There's a number of technical mechanisms you can use, but we try to be pretty maniacal about customer love first before we even talk about significant scaling. Because I can scale the product. We've got 70 million, 75 million customers at Nubank. I can make any dead cat bounce. I can make any product I launch look great for the first year. But that doesn't matter. What matters is, do the customers love it? Because then it'll explode out on its own accord. And that's what we really try to
So
focus
you
on.
mentioned dead cat bouncing there. You mentioned it to me earlier, and I had no idea what you were talking about. And in the notes, I was like, bizarre. I haven't heard this. What is the illusion of dead cats bouncing? Before I forget to ask this.
So, sure. So, from your world, from the world of investing, there are lots of dead companies that, have a nice rally at some point on their way to zero. And that can often trick investors. The way that tends to happen in massive and largely successful technology companies is sort of the following arc. Company launches a product, great entrepreneurial energy, great customer focus. That product takes off. Maybe there's a second one of those that are really, really successful. Then the company gets big. The founder becomes the CEO, cannot be as close to driving that stuff quite as tightly. And a professional product team takes over and sort of forgets the inherent, you got to get customer love before you can explode out. On top of it, you've got, the CFO and the CEO saying, our next wave of products has to be really big to matter. And so you start focusing on making early launches really big before they are genuinely loved. And then all of the incentives can go haywire. And I've seen this at pretty much every company I worked with. It's one of the things I obsess about and I'm paranoid about at Nubank as we start to get really big, is making sure that we aren't bouncing dead cats, that we aren't launching products that customers don't actually like, where we're milking the Nubank brand, where we're milking the hyper successful initial products we've got, rather than adding to the brand and adding to the product portfolio in terms of value to customers. Because just take Facebook as an example. You've got 1 billion plus daily active users. I guarantee you, I can launch any product and make it look great for the first 6 months, the first year. And guess what? I can get promoted that way. Now, what are my incentives? My incentives are to make every product look good, even when it isn't actually working.
So what are the metrics that reveal true customer love in that time period? If you have a smart practitioner who can make anything look good, how do you determine between the true good versus the fake good?
The ultimate metric that I try to focus on is churn. Because if I have a leaky bucket in the early days, I can fill it up because I got 1 billion daily users I can pour into it. But you will never fill that bucket if it's got a bunch of holes in the middle, in the bottom. And so churn is the ultimate metric. And then you start looking for what are the leading metrics for churn. And that's where things like the Sean Ellis survey and even NPS, which we tend to use pretty maniacally and pretty religiously. And if we cannot get a Sean Ellis survey score that's actually above what Sean himself recommends, well above, we're not focused on scaling it. We're focused on iterating it, again, for love, not for scale. And that's our attempt. That's, back to one of your first questions. That's our attempt to turn art into science. We've started going back to, having leaders of business product managers just go call 10 customers. Call 10 customers who are using the product and just get a visceral sense. And don't ask someone else in the customer experience team to call them. You call them. Because there's no other way. And by the way, bring your engineering lead with you in that call. And just listen to what they have to say. And that part is some of the art. Let's just listen if there's real enthusiasm or if they're trying to be polite to you. And customers are polite, are unfortunately, human beings are polite by nature. And that's great in life and not great for product managers who can fool us.
How do you feel about the segmentation or the category that you're in altering churn by pure category? And what I mean by that is if you are in productivity tools or CRM or whatever, well, CRM is actually a bad example, but productivity tools or consumer, churn is very high, it's very easy. Banks is like phone contracts. People don't change banks with as much ease and flexibility as they do pretty much every other product, I think. Maybe homes would be the same. So is churn really a good predictor of love for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point that you make, that there are a lot of people who get trapped with companies, and being trapped is different than being in a committed relationship.
No, that's called marriage, Jag.
You're going to get me...
No comment.
No. What we have started to use for Nubank, and this is part of the journey for us over the last 3 years, is we have a definition, the technical details of which don't really matter, but we have a definition of do we have a customer, do we have an active customer, and do we have a primary, what we call a primary banking relationship? And we have been obsessed. Our board actually, the first board meeting I participated in back in, and it was March 2020, it was actually 3 days before pandemic locked us all down. And they pushed very hard on the question of, you're growing like crazy, but are these people treating us as a primary banking relationship? And we got obsessed about that since that push. And we've been growing that metric pretty dramatically month over month for 3 years now. And so there is churn, and we pay attention to that. And then there is, are you growing the share of your customers who are primary banking relationship? And are we driving, and this is something that Facebook and other social networks use, are we driving our intensity of engagement? Daily active users over monthly active users over all customers. That intensity of engagement combined with some of these customer love metrics, you start to cobble together a picture.
Can I ask, how do you define primary banking relationship? Is that it? Like the big thing in the UK and Europe is, do they shift salary input from traditional bank to their new bank? Is that the same for you? How do you define that?
Yeah, altered for the realities of how that payroll deposit works in Brazil and in Latin America. That's basically what we're getting towards, is are they moving the bulk of their incoming money into Nubank before they start, spending and saving and doing the rest of their financial lives?
Can I ask, what percent of your users is primary first bank is Nubank?
Yeah, we, by our metrics, and we, just announced this as part of our quarterly update, we are well north of 40% of all customers, not of actives, but of all customers. And again, that's part of us holding ourselves to a high bar. So when 3 years ago, that metric was about 10%. And so we've grown it 4x, even as we've grown the customer base 3.5x in the last 3 years.
Do you want usage? Sorry, I'm just so interested now. Do you want usage? Because on a bank, maybe, they have the card. You don't want them to log into the app. They probably log in when there's a problem or when they, aren't sure about something. How do you feel about usage when maybe it doesn't correlate to customer love?
Yeah, look, we are keyed first on customer love. The first value of Nubank when David, Chris, and Ed founded the company, is one of the reasons, frankly, I joined, back to your earlier question, was I visited Sao Paulo, and in the lobby was this very odd statement. We want, if value number one, we want our customers to love us, interesting word, fanatically. That's the word we use. We want our customers to love us fanatically. And that is exactly how I think about it. So we are keyed off on that from day one at Nubank, value one at Nubank. We believe, in the context of what we are trying to do in our strategy, that intensity of engagement with our app is actually a leading indicator of that customer love. And we've proven that to ourselves. You're right that in concept, someone could never use the app or almost never use the app and still love the product because, they're using the credit card or what have you. But for us, what we found is intensity of usage is a lead indicator for customer love. Ultimately, what we care about is customer love, but we track both because we believe one's a leading indicator of the other.
Can I ask, speaking of the product, you have so many different ways you can take product, with new products, with features. How do you decide what to do next? How do you prioritize product decisions, Jag?
Again, it's aligned with what we think allows us to become a leading player aligned with the mission of the company. We want to transform services, including financial services, across Latin America. So a couple of things become obvious about that. We didn't say Brazil, we said Latin America. So launching in Mexico and Colombia 3 years ago was, I wouldn't say a no-brainer, but it was an obvious thing, obvious mountain we needed to climb. We started 3-4 years ago, call it about 4 years ago, as essentially, and I'm overstating for simplicity, a Brazilian credit card company. We knew, and David was very clear, that we were on a journey from a Brazilian credit card company to being a full solution Latin American financial services company. That's a mouthful, but it's clear. That means you have to have investments. You have to offer insurance. You have to do lending. In Latin America, consumers tend to consolidate their financial lives with one primary institution. And we had made a lot of headway in deconstructing financial services in Brazil, and the reconsolidation with the traction we had was the next play. And so we've been climbing two mountains simultaneously over the last 3 to 4 years. One, proving that the model extended beyond Brazil, which was a question 3 years ago. And second, proving that we were more than a credit card company, which was also a big question 3 years ago.
Why was it a question that you were more than Brazil? The cultures are relatively similar. I mean, it's not, Southeast Asia compared to LATAM, which is obviously bigger. Like, they are relatively aligned in terms of cultures. Why was it a question?
For me, it was obvious, and it was back before I joined Nubank. To me, it was an obvious next move, and the timing felt roughly right. But this was a question investors were asking. Are there unique aspects of Brazil that make this a one-off? Can you actually do it beyond the country? And there are some, technical specifics. The working capital cycle for credit cards in Brazil is very favorable for a credit card company for what we're trying to do, which is almost compared to anywhere else in the world. Mexico and Colombia are much more typical. So there were some technical reasons why, but we firmly believe that Mexicans and Colombians were roughly as poorly served as Brazilians were, and that the formula we had come up with, both starting with the culture and leading into the products, was something that we could extend, but we had to prove it. Which gets back to execution, to go full circle.
You're a leader of product. You have resource allocation at the front of your mind. You mentioned all those different new products that you have now, but that you had to build out over time. How do you think about the right ratio of allocating between core product, innovation, and scaling and growth?
Yeah, and a bit of art with a rule of thumb. I grew up at Google. We used to talk about 70-20-10 there. It's a poor heuristic, but it's something we sort of roughly tend to use. We want to make sure we don't lose sight of continuing to invest to improve in our core products and our core handful of products now. And so we put a disproportionate effort on making sure every pixel is perfect, or as perfect as we can make it, and improving. We want to make sure we have small teams, going back to something we talked about earlier, who can do big things. So our insurance or investments or lending team, when they started, was a dozen people, and we're like, go change the world. Go come up with something fundamentally different, not incrementally better, because incrementally better isn't going to get anybody to notice. So we're going to obsess about, you dozen people, come up with fundamentally better. Only when you get to fundamentally better will you get the next round of investment, meaning people. And when you launch, make sure there's customer love, because only when you get customer love are you going to get more investment at that stage, and on and on. And so we try to intentionally limit resourcing with a small group of creative, hyper-creative, hyper-driven people who think they can change the world. And that gets back to the autonomy and the drive and the clarity that we talked about earlier.
How often do you do product reviews, and who's invited to them? And any best learnings from what makes a great one great?
We do at least a half dozen weekly.
Half dozen weekly?
Weekly, yeah. Because we'll do product reviews on like one small element of a product. We'll obsess about the details of this aspect of the flow. So there are some areas at any one time where I'm personally obsessed by, that either they are the next new thing or something might be struggling or whatever it is. And I'm in a bi-weekly cycle with the team. And then there is just a general slot where we have 2 or 3 open slots, and we're like, sign up, and people will come with, hey, we're thinking about XYZ problem. making one great is hard because you're balancing two things. You're trying to be inclusive, and particularly in a Zoom world, you could include 100 people in your product review. And a very inclusive meeting works against the second thing you're optimizing for, which is this is a safe space for us to brainstorm together. And frankly, I don't think we're succeeding at balancing those two things anywhere near optimally, if I'm honest.
Which one would you lean towards?
I would like to lean towards having the safe space, because a product team should feel safe to come in and not do a dog and pony show for senior management and tell us how everything is great, but tell us where the warts are, what things aren't working, what things they're struggling with, and have ideas about what they're thinking about, some of which will be bad ideas. It should be a learning environment. I read once an article about Pixar and how they do it. And there are elements of that we tried to incorporate, although I don't think fully successfully. And what they tried to do is they'll have every director of a Pixar movie be in a room, and they will give the current director of the current big movie bet brutal feedback, ruthless feedback. But then it's on the current director to decide which feedback to take and which to. So they get everyone's opinion, and then they're very clear about who the decision maker is and who's got the autonomy. And how do you balance that safe space with that inclusivity? How do you balance senior participation with the autonomy for the person who's actually on the ground making the decision? That's hard. That's really hard.
Yeah, that is hard. Can I ask, you said that decision. Before we move into a quick fire, David asked me to ask this one. When you review the decisions you've made, what's the product decision that you think is best that you've made at Nubank? And what product decision do you think is the worst product decision you made at Nubank?
David's got you doing his work for
him. Yeah, literally.
One of the decisions I think that we did really well, and we did it essentially in the first handful of months of the pandemic, was we had, for context, we were a credit card company. It was doing very well. We had over the course of the previous year, we had launched our bank account product, and it had unleashed this wave of growth. We almost, I think, tripled the number of customers. We had an engagement challenge. Those customers who were getting the account but weren't yet getting the credit card were struggling. We were struggling to get them fully engaged. We did two things that I think were very, very powerful in driving the engagement and the primary relationship and going after. We were pretty decisive about making a shift from being a savings account only, and we had a very specific and appealing value prop there, to being a transactional daily bank account. And that was basically by incorporating every transactional mode there was, from debit card, which is the most old school thing you can imagine, which was actually massively successful, to this central bank sponsored mobile real-time payment system in Brazil called Pix, which has taken off, perhaps other than India, arguably other than India, is easily the most successful real-time mobile payment system in the world, is in Brazil. And we bet big on that, and we sweat every pixel of that flow for sign up, because customers were going to decide who was going to get those keys for their Pix. And we made it as simple to sign up and as simple to use as we possibly could, and we drove the team crazy. That was one bet. The second big bet is we launched a secured card product in Brazil, which said, hey, we can't yet sponsor you for credit because you haven't yet proven the credit worthiness that would allow us to do so in an economically sound way. But we can help you get on that first ladder of opportunity by proving that you will pay off your credit card against a security deposit, which is a common product in the US, but hadn't been done in Brazil. And that allowed us to start offering credit and get people on their first rung of the ladder of opportunity and credit in the country. And that's been massively successful. And those two things together have been key drivers of our growth. So we're really, really, really proud of that. And in terms of the product that we're struggling to, we've struggled for a while to get exactly right. And it gets down to what we talked about earlier about clarity, is our suite of products for the upmarket, for the high income segment in Brazil has not had, and I have not cracked myself, the degree of clarity of what makes that offering fundamentally different for that target customer set.
Why do you think it hasn't cracked yet?
Part of what I tell myself is, you're a Brit, so I'll come to you with a Churchill quote. Victory is going from defeat to defeat without loss of enthusiasm. The biggest single reason is we need clarity, and we need a degree of focus on what every product that I've ever been involved with that's succeeded has had one core characteristic. It has been fundamentally different, not incrementally better. Because the only way you break through the noise is you got something fundamentally different for a very specific person in mind, and that person loves it so much that they tell their friends. And that's how we have our, cost of acquisition so low at Nubank. That's the only way you break through. You cannot take on an entrenched player head on. That's a recipe for failure. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at the problem. And so we've got to come up with something that's just fundamentally different, with a clear customer in mind, and that's what we're working on.
My friend, I want to move into a quick fire. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thought. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
I'm thrilled that we didn't send this out too far ahead of time, because otherwise this would be a total deviation from it. Tell me, when do you listen to users versus when to ignore them?
You always listen to users, which doesn't mean you follow exactly what they say.
I've been fascinated about this one for a while. Why have Brazilian banks responded? Have the incumbent Brazilian banks responded to Nubank, or have they just kind of ceded that they've lost that market and that segment?
I think the very best incumbent banks have started to respond, and one of the things I'm proudest of, I'm sure David even more so, is we have forced the bar to be raised for customers across the board. And so that is something we face, is the bar against which we compete is rising all the time, quite rapidly over the last 2 or 3 years through the pandemic. So yes, they are responding.
Why do so few fintechs never master credit?
I think credit is a very hard thing to crack. It's not inherently technology. It is only partially technology based. And one of the, I think, most masterful decisions that the early Nubank team did was they decided to start on the hard thing first, rather than get going and figure out we'll crack it later. And therefore it is built into the DNA of the company at a very deep level, and it is a great counterbalance or complement to the tech orientation that we've got as well. And so that combination is a very rare thing to have, and a very hard thing to balance.
What's the biggest mistake founders make when hiring product teams?
That's a hard one. I would say that the hardest thing that founders, the biggest problem and mistake founders make is they go for the credential of the person who succeeded at big company XYZ, which is a very different mindset than succeeding in a highly ambiguous pre-success mode of a startup.
Tell me, what one piece of advice would you give to a product leader starting a new role today?
Be incredibly clear about what hill you're going to take. Someone just told me yesterday, actually, someone on our board, on the Nubank board, told me priorities is not a plural. And I like that. Be very, very clear on what is your priority and what you absolutely need to get right, and be very focused only on that.
What makes David so special?
There are any number of things, from the courage as a Colombian to enter the Brazilian market, not speaking Portuguese, and have the audacity to think you'll take on some of the most profitable banks in the world. But the thing that I've observed that I would most call out from working closely with him is his complete openness to changing his mind. He holds strong opinions weekly in a way that is beyond the soundbite or the cliche of that phrase. He will make a strong argument in one direction, and 2 weeks later, he will tell you why he was completely wrong, with no ego and a complete willingness to pivot. And it is very hard at times, and the more junior you are, the harder it is to like keep oriented, because there's such an instinct to please the CEO and the founder. But he's genuine about it, and he wants to hear the argument, and he's genuinely processing the argument, not listening to you to rebut. And that is I learned from that every day, and I try to remind myself every day, it's not important to win the argument. It's important for us collectively to get to be right.
The final one, what recent company product strategy have you been most impressed by, where you thought, that's smart, I like that?
Yeah. You had Gustav on, I don't know exactly when, but fairly recently.
Yeah, 3 or 4 months ago.
And the first product I did in Silicon Valley when I joined Google was Google Audio, and which is a failed product in the end. But one of the privileges of that role back in, I think it was 2000, late 2006, early 2007, was I got to play with the desktop demo version of Spotify back in the day. And I played a few Bob Marley tunes and thought, this is pretty cool. To see the evolution of that company through mobile, through subscriptions, more recently through podcasts. I now probably spend 3/4 of my Spotify listening time, which is at least doubled through the pandemic, listening to podcasts more than listening to music. It's been masterful. He's done the whole series. I know a podcast series on how they did it and how they thought about it. And the way they have balanced this keen focus on the customer need with this deep, profoundly deep, and Gustav embodies this deep technical understanding of the technologies involved, it's just been masterful. So I'm in awe of what they've achieved.
I call him the Daniel Craig of product. I mean, body of an Adonis, and the voice is just so soft and silky. Listen, Jag, I've absolutely loved this. I've wanted to do this for a while. Thank you so much for being so brilliant, and you've been an incredible guest.
Harry, I've enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you so much for the chance to chat.